Welcome back to the History of the Papacy Podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey.
Steve and Garry Stevens of the History of the Bible podcast continue their discussion on the Samaritan people and religion. They discuss how Samaritanism interacted with both Second Temple Judaism and Christianity, and make a few speculations along the way. Now let's join Garry and Steve.
Early Christians may have made inroads with the Samaritans really early on, as early as John the Baptizer's proto-Christian sect, or however you want to refer to his potential sect. That's another great speculation. So keep your podcatchers for updated for both of our podcasts on more speculations. But this idea of John the Baptist or John the Baptizer having his own sect that merged into early Christian sects is something that Garry and I have speculated on other episodes, and I have a feeling we'll be doing it again soon. There's textual evidence to support this idea, and even an actual group that exists in small numbers today that are believed to be remnants or an offshoot of John the Baptist sect called the Mandeans. They may, and this group may have originated in or very close to Samaria. The Samaritans may have seen this Jesus thing, quote unquote, as a viable alternative to capitulating to other groups of Second Temple Jews that they really didn't like and didn't really get along with. Groups like the Judeans to the south, they both saw each other ethnically, religiously, and culturally, as we said, as the other. And the Galileans and the Samaritans may have seen each other as maybe less of the other, at least compared to the Judeans. I wonder what you think, Garry, as this idea that I'm speculating on is that maybe the Galileans were seen as less of an enemy than the Judeans.
I suppose it must be the case. I remember coming across a quote, supposedly by some Jew of antiquity, but I've never been able to find either the quote or the source again. But what the quote was to the effect that the Galileans are half pagan Jews. I don't know. But it would seem to me, in a sense, if the Jews did believe they were in some sense half pagan, that makes them less dangerous than the Samaritans. I don't know what I'm trying to say. So I got no idea, Steve. I have no idea.
Let's take another quick look at another interesting tidbit from the Bible on the Samaritans. And this is the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman from the Gospel of John, chapter 4, verses 1 through 26, which I believe is from the New International Version. Do you want to read that one, Garry? Go for your second cold read.
I had forgotten about that story completely. So let's get back to it. Here we go. Now Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon, when a Samaritan woman came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." Oh, another one take.
Yes, the one taker. The early Christians, if you look at the Dura Europos church, they really love this passage. That was one of the main pieces of iconography in the Dura Europos Church, was the woman at the well. We learn a couple of things from this passage, that Jesus was traveling through Samaria. His disciples were out there buying groceries. So they are interacting with the people. So the animosity can't be that terrible, that Jesus and company are running through the place, hanging out, purchasing. It's like planning to have enough gas in your car so that you don't have to stop in that certain entire state. So you can just drive through that, so you don't have to stop and get a bag of chips and a tank of gas. We won't mention what state that is, but we all know which one it is.
Oh, I want you to mention it. I want to hear it. I want to hear it. Which state?
Oh, for me, it's everybody out there. They'll know what it is. I know everybody has their state where they make sure that they gas up so they don't have to stop. But Jesus doesn't gas up before Samaria, which I don't think you could. I think you would have to. I mean, just looking at that, what's the name of the website where you can map travel distances in the ancient world? You can't do it precisely.
There's a great academic website called Orbis, where you can plot routes in the Roman world, going by land, sea. I was going to say air, but no, let's forget that one. And see how much it would cost and how long it would take.
And they don't have a city that's quite in Galilee to quite Jerusalem, but you can get pretty close in there. And I don't think it was a 1-day trip by foot. But so you would have to, but you could certainly pack enough food to get through that without having to hit up the people along the way. Jesus stops to take a drink at Jacob's well, and the land that was given to his son Joseph. And this points to the fact there was a shared importance of stories to both peoples, the Samaritans and the Jews. They both respected this Jacob's well and a shared inheritance. And the woman knows that she shouldn't be associating with Jesus because he's a Jew and she's a Samaritan, yet she still draws him a nice cool drink of water, and they have a sit down to talk. Now, here's the last couple of verses, and we're going to see if Garry can make it 3 for 3 on cold reads.
If I do it in one take, I demand a prize.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors.
Okay, so there's quite a lot of verses there. Are you ready? Sir, the woman said, I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. Woman, Jesus replied, believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshippers must worship in the Spirit and in truth. The woman said, I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. Then Jesus declared, I, the one speaking to you, I am he. I want my prize. I want my prize.
I think once you've tapped out your bottle of honey, Guarabee's honey, that there'll be a second one on the way. Airmail.
Cool.
Get your Guarabee's honey. Oh, mid-roll ad. So we see beyond going 3 for 3, the trinity of cold reads for Garry. We see right in the New Testament that we're seeing more of a mention of the shared tradition. The Jews and the Samaritans may have different mountains and temples, but Jesus is offering the Jews and the Samaritans something new. And obviously within Second Temple Judaism, this whole messianic talk is something that's very popular. The Samaritans certainly would have heard about it, but from what I've read, it wasn't something that would have been a theme from pre-exile Israelite religion necessarily, and not necessarily something that the Samaritans would have been all over. But Jesus tells her, the woman at the well, that he is the Messiah and is inviting her into his Messiahship, if you will. Now, this woman at the well is a story, and that's an event in the gospel that the writers say actually happened during Jesus's ministry. So that first story, or the first tale, you might say, or excerpt that we shared of the Good Samaritan, that's a parable. So a parable as a teaching tool, whereas what the gospel writers are trying to say, or in particular the Gospel of John is saying, is that this scenario with the woman at the well actually happened. And they're both very familiar tales. So the parables, they're a literary genre, and they're short little tales, I guess you might say, that are meant to teach by analogy. And so you get a little tale, and then you're supposed to extrapolate what that story or analogy is how that's supposed to apply to your own life or a different circumstance. And Jesus uses parable, the genre, throughout the entire Gospels. The short parable is that the person has been beaten up, robbed, and left on the side of the road. And the two priests walk by this guy, and even though he's in great distress because he might be ritually impure or otherwise unjust, they don't want to get involved in this situation. But then the Samaritan walked by, and he took care of the poor soul. He even went way above and beyond what would be expected. He's paying his medical bills. He's putting him up for the night. And this story of the Good Samaritan has many interpretations, and that's really what the point of the parable is to pull out a lot of different interpretations. So we can look at it through the lens of what Jesus was trying to say about the Samaritans, that the Pharisees act all high and mighty, but when it gets down to brass tacks, to the practical everyday activities, they're all show. And we see that in many parables. That we also see that someone as lowly as a Samaritan, the hated Samaritan, went and did the right thing. And then not only does the Good Samaritan do the right thing, he goes to extreme hospitality and comfort, which makes me think of our episode with Scott McAndless about the extreme hospitality of Abraham. So I can see that they're in this parable, Jesus is trying to pull in a lot of things that people would have known that he's telling this tale to. And as the Bible often does, it gives us an inversion. The Pharisee priest should have been the good guy, and the Samaritan should have been the bad guy. And then that would have played right into the preconceived notion of a Second Temple Jew in the first century. But then that whole preconceived notion gets flipped on its head, which is really what a good parable is supposed to do. And I have to believe that this parable was included not only to make a kind of a point, a jab at the hypocrisy of the Levitical priests, but also, at least in my opinion, is to give the Samaritans some humanity.
Yeah, good point.
And then I'm going to save Garry from another cold reading. But if you go to Acts chapter 8, verses 1-9, and this is post death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus, there's more examples in that early message of Jesus's message being spread in Samaria. So I wonder, even at this earliest time, the first mid to late first century AD, if we're already seeing that the gospel writers and these first disciples and apostles of the Jesus movement saw Samaria as ripe ground. But then we get some counter evidence here. The Gospel of Matthew takes a slightly different tack on the Samaritans, which I would expect, as Matthew is the most Jewish of the Gospels. So maybe he's seeing things more from a Jewish perspective. And I'll I'll save Garry. Do you want to go for the short quote?
No, we experts reserve our voice for the long ones.
Okay.
So you can take the short ones, Steve.
These 12 Jesus sent out and commanded to them, saying, do not go into the way of the Gentiles, and do not enter a city of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And that's from the New International Version, Matthew chapter 10, verses 5-6. So this doesn't explicitly say the Samaritans are irredeemable, but the focus should really be more on the Jews proper, which makes sense given that the Gospel of Jewish, despite being claimed by many and even scholars that it's anti-Semitic, it really is coming more from the Jewish perspective. We've discussed that in the past, that Matthew definitely, he's going after the Jews because he's going after the people who he thinks are the most likely to turn. It's almost a play on this whole Samaritans. You're the most confrontational with the people you're most similar to. So Matthew is likely more focused internally than he is externally. The people of Israel, according to him, real Israel, Second Temple Jews, should be the focus of this new movement, not all these other people, or at least based on this one quote. When you talk about the Samaritans, we can get into some of the things like the lost 10 tribes of Israel. I'm purposefully skimming over this part of the story. There were 12 tribes of Israel, coming from the story of Genesis at the very end of Genesis. Jacob, also known as Israel, split his inheritance between his 12 sons, technically 11 sons and 2 grandsons. Joseph doesn't get a cut himself, but then his 2 sons get an equal share. When the Israelites went back to Canaan, they split up the land amongst the 11 of the 12 tribes, except for the Levites. They didn't get land because they were the priestly class. The tribes of Judah and Benjamin, they lived in what was Judea or Judah in the south, and then the rest of the 10 of the 12 tribes lived in the northern area, which would correspond roughly with the northern kingdom of Israel. And it is traditionally believed that of the 12 tribes of Israel, 10 lived in the northern kingdom, but they were destroyed by the Assyrians, and the legend is they disappeared. And in their disappearance, they may have become the Khazars or the British or any number of other people.
So I love that. Yeah, they may have become the British. I remember there was a shop in Sydney many decades ago run by the British Israelite Society, which had big old posters showing how, the Brits were descended from the Israelites. Now, right, how did they come up with that theory?
I think you can tell Garry, both Garry and I are highly dubious of that accounting. But sure, some of these people of Israel were likely deported and exiled, but definitely not 10 entire tribes of thousands of people. Most of the people just stayed put and continued to live their best lives. Most of them continued to practice their version of the Israelite religion, and over the course of centuries evolved into Samaritans. Depending on your point of view, either a heretical group of Jews, a cousin religion, a sect of Judaism, something completely different, or something in between. And so as we're getting to the end of this whole discussion of the Samaritans, let's take a look at Samaritans, Jews, and Christians. Like I said earlier, the seed of this episode was originally supposed to be a quick 2-minute discussion of why there was a gap in Second Temple Jewish archaeology around the area north of Judea but south of Galilee. This episode will actually wind up being longer than the episode that I took it out of, as you'll see in future episodes. But I think it's an important discussion, though to the larger context of what we're trying to talk about in this series. Where did Christians come from? We don't have popes of Rome if we don't have Christians. And where did Christians come from? So you get a lot of my opinions in here as a rank amateur and a lot of speculations from Garry and I. But I was listening to the latest episode of Mark Goodacre's podcast, professor from Duke University, and he actually endorses well thought out speculation. So let's speculate. So here are some speculations that I thought I would throw out there, and maybe we can chew over them a little bit, to Garry and I, and then later on in comments with the good people listening. So I think there's some nagging questions that always have been on my mind is, why did Christianity spread so quickly, particularly in the East? Overall, the Christianity was a relatively small percentage of the population of the Roman Empire around the time of, say, Constantine. I mean, nobody knows precisely, but I've heard the number 25% thrown around a lot. Have you heard that? Oh, wait, do you have a moment? A great way to support the History of the Papacy podcast is by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. Your support on Patreon goes such a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable and on the air for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in the order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you will be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now, here's a brief message from our sponsors.
Yeah, it's looking like that. Because I've been sort of investigating this, and you're quite right. No one really knows. Yeah, at about the time of Constantine, probably was about something like 25%. Yeah, nowhere near a majority.
But that population was not spread out evenly. In the West, there was a tiny percent of the population. But then in the East, there were some areas that were 100% Christian by the time of Constantine. So why is that? Do you have any wild speculations for that?
I do, yes. Christianity was from the start an urban religion. And one thing which I didn't realize until I read about it, the Roman Empire was highly urbanized. Apparently, the United States of America did not become as urbanized as the Roman Empire until the late 19th century.
No way.
Yeah, so that's astonishing. So the Roman Empire, compared to previous empires and medieval times, had a lot of big cities with lots of people in them, and the East was by far the most urbanized area. So if Christianity starts off as an urban religion, it makes sense that the East is going to be the region, the Greek-speaking East, which I suppose has the most Christians to start off. That's my speculation.
I learned an interesting little factoid that made me think is the city of Gaza, and that would be really the extreme southern end of the Levant, was almost 0% Christian, very, very tiny Christian percentage, all the way up to the time of John Chrysostom in the late 300s, early 400s AD. And there's a book that was written contemporary to that time by Mark the Deacon called it's one of the more simple titles back then. It was just called The Life of Porphyrius, Bishop of Gaza. And a big chunk of the book is saying, this contemporary book is saying that Christianity really didn't catch on because the town fathers, the people who ran the town, were hardcore pagans, and they just did everything in their power to keep Christianity out. And you can see they didn't have an idea of retail conversion like we see it today. If the town which the towns and the urban areas, especially in the East, had a lot of independence. If they wanted to hold something down, unless they got the ire of the governor or eventually Rome or Constantinople, they could potentially make it so that Christianity couldn't get a foothold.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, that reminds me of the Reformation, doesn't it? When some of the little German principalities, the prince said, okay, I'm becoming a Protestant. How about you guys? That sort of thing. And certainly I've read that if we look at the hierarchical system in the Roman Empire, where a family is headed by a paterfamilias, if the paterfamilias converts to whatever, the rest of the family goes along with him. It basically has to, doesn't have, including the slaves, everybody. So if the leaders aren't pro-Christian, no, I suppose it's just not going to happen. Yeah.
Plus, if it's under the radar, the governor in Caesarea thinks that everything's running fine in Gaza. What's the point of getting involved too heavily? It's how the Romans pretty much operated. As long as you weren't rocking the boat, you could go along to get along. It wasn't until people started rocking the boat, then the governor comes down, and then the emperor came down on them, and that's eventually what happened in Gaza. And I mean, that's pretty much what you see as the theme through the 400s, is that it's becoming very difficult to not be Christian in these. And then in the West, it happens really quickly because, or at least on the surface, the conversion happens really quickly because the imperial authorities had more control over the cities, and they weren't quite as independent as they were in the East.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And again, like you were, what you were saying is that when the paterfamilias, it's not, even if the paterfamilias converts, it's not just him and Junior and their 2.5 children and their pet dog and their pet cat. It's an entire industry, essentially, that's getting converted. And slaves, but even beyond slaves, they're clients, they're people who are associated with them in business and finance. There's a lot of incentive for them to convert as well.
I've forgotten about the clients. Yeah, I've forgotten about the whole client system. Good point.
That's a lot of chain in the network that will start dominoes falling, or whatever analogy you want to use. But once that starts to roll, it gets so much inertia, and it's just so much different. I think it's completely antithetical to the way we think about religion to this day. Of a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness comes to your house and tries to convert you, and maybe grandma thinks it's really interesting and she starts becoming a Jehovah's Witness, but everybody else, I'm not going to stop going to the Episcopal Church that we've been going to for 20 years for Christmas and Easter. Like they would have seen it completely differently.
Yeah, very true.
We can also look at Christianity at this point. You're not necessarily buying into a specific creed as of this point. You're buying into a really big idea. And so you're accepting a broad set of principles, and you start to attend one of these local clubs. And so that's another way. So maybe that the religion does get injected in that way, but it's still, especially getting on in centuries from the earliest times, it's becoming more institutionalized. And then, so I think how this is sort of a circuitous way to get back to the Samaritans. I think that in a way, Christianity would have been a very viable alternative for Samaritans, especially I think more later on, that when Christianity becomes, even though it's not technically legal until 313 and the Edict of Milan, it was, if you have towns by the time of Constantine that are 100%, and we have that whole era of the long history, or the long piece of the church, I can see that for a Samaritan, becoming a Christian, not dramatically different than what you're already doing, it probably is a viable alternative.
Yeah, particularly after the final Roman-Jewish war. Yeah.
Yeah, because they would have really been stuck in the middle of that. What are you? You're not a Jew. You're not pagan. What are you? Sort of like the early Christians. You had to find some identity to not be involved in that madness.
I recall Bar Josefa was exceedingly annoyed when both the Samaritans and the Christians said, no, we're not really interested in your death war.
And then, yeah, I think that Samaritan, and there is some archaeological evidence of Samaritan Christians, but it's sort of another blank in the archaeological and textual sources, that there isn't a ton of information on what was going at that time. But I think you can see the logical inference that could be made that you don't want to be associated with Jews necessarily, with all of these persecutions that happen and forced removals. You become a Christian, you're something a little bit different. You can see they could carve out a little space to live there, and you can still fold in some of your Samaritanism into Christianity, at least at that point.
Yeah.
And in the end, we'll likely never know what happened exactly. Maybe there is a text somewhere laying at the bottom of a Genezer or in the Vatican Library that lays it all out in bullet points. But we can always speculate, and I would love to hear your speculations. And I won't speak for Garry, but I have a feeling he would love to hear your speculations and arguments for and against all of our speculations. And I want to thank Garry, as always, for coming on and for nailing 3 long gospel verses in a row. Garry, why don't you tell the people out there about your podcast? I would imagine at this point they're very familiar, but there's no harm in a little review.
Hi, my podcast, History in the Bible, I'd almost forgotten the name then. My podcast, History in the Bible, is wrapping up soon. There'll be bonus episodes indefinitely, but the main narrative will wrap up with my special guest star. Yes, the other man in this conversation, Steve. And we are going to be talking speculations, alternative history, counterfactuals.
Woohoo, I can't wait.
That should be fun. Oh, yes.
All right. And thank you again, Garry. And we will talk to you next time. Can we get a toodles?
You sure can. Toodles.
Hey, before we go, let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the history of the Papacy Diptychs. We have, at the Alexandria level, Roberto, William B., Brian, Christina, Augustus, Judy, and Max. At the Constantinople, we have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Amma the Great, Geoffrey the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jim the Great. With that, I hope you enjoy this next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.
Oh